record. Hearing now resumed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Just on the record briefly, we could have started 4 minutes ago, but Mr. Wallace was absent. He's absent again. I hadn't looked up. I wasted that line. And the registrar is ready with a red card, which looks decidedly pink. Could we go to Exhibit 216? This question, I suppose, could be for Ms. Farlinger to start with, and really my questions are regarding the precautionary approach used in aquaculture. You're familiar with this document. It dates back to 2002.
Yes, I am.
And really, at least from that point, and perhaps before 2002 and certainly up until present, you would agree that DFO's primary consideration as it relates to fisheries matters is conservation, and that also the DFO would apply a precautionary approach to aquaculture?
Yes.
If you could go to page 21, PDF 25. And the paragraph that starts, although conservation, near the bottom middle, Mr. Lund. So this is a bit of an overarching statement, speaking of conservation of wild fish stocks being the primary consideration. Where applicable, DFO will consider social and economic benefits associated with aquaculture development in the course of those decisions.
I see that, yes.
And if we could then go to, more specifically, to aquaculture in the context of the precautionary approach, which is PDF 28, page 24. And this refers in further detail to the precautionary approach as a distinctive approach within the realm of risk management. Do you see those words on the screen, Ms. Farlinger?
I do.
And so this describes how DFO at that point in time attempted to apply the precautionary approach, and again, you continue to try to apply that approach as it relates to aquaculture on the West Coast today.
Yes, we do.
Can you describe briefly the precautionary approach and adaptive management as two terms that may overlap somewhat in your lexicon?
The precautionary approach, as described in detail by Mr. Bevan last week, it is taking into account the risk of catastrophic events or problems and mitigating against them. And the adaptive approach is continuing to learn from various, in this case, management regimes.
Thank you. Mr. Lund, could we please go to Exhibit 1906? Just so this is being brought up on the screen. Members of the panel, this document was introduced into evidence, I believe on September 20th by Mr. Mamarek, and it was a paper of Mr. Peterman. Do you see it on the screen there now? An overview of the precautionary approach in fisheries and some suggestion extensions. I suppose I'll stay with you, if I may. Ms. Farlinger, are you familiar with this particular document?
I've certainly seen it before. I wouldn't say I've reviewed it in detail, but I've certainly seen it before.
Is there anyone else who's looked at it in any greater detail?
I've looked at it, and I'm not sure I can claim to have seen it in any, or studied it in more detail than Ms. Farlinger, but I've seen it.
Well, I'll take you to 2 pages. I only have the paper copy, sir. It's paper copy 234 and 235. There we are. Just take a moment and highlight from the bolded at the bottom precautionary principles to the bottom, please. So you'll see that in this particular passage of this exhibit, there's a discussion of the precautionary approach and the distinction between the precautionary principle and the precautionary approach. I'm sure you're all scanning it as the rest of us are. You'll see that there's a table at the bottom, or rather I should say a line graph, I guess, where you apply the precautionary principle and where you might apply a precautionary approach. And do you see the way in which this paper tries to graphically demonstrate the distinction between the two? Mr. Bevan?
Yes, I do. I'm not sure we share this exact understanding, but clearly what they've got is a spectrum of risk and consequences of the problems, and a suggested reaction to deal with those and mitigate those risks.
I'm going to ask Mr. Lund to go over to the next page and then have Mr. Bevan perhaps pick up on that theme. That first full paragraph, precautionary approach, there's reference there, sir, to fisheries scientists and managers and the choices that have to be made, and the use of the precautionary approach to reflect the knowledge that a fisheries manager may have. And the bottom portion, the last 4 lines of that paragraph says, the precautionary approach to fisheries management is thus more flexible than simply applying the precautionary principle in the presence of major uncertainties. This frequently overlooked distinction is important because it can make the differences between clear communications and misunderstandings among scientists and managers and stakeholders. Now, that's the whole sum of the passages that I wanted to refer you to, the table on the previous page and this page. Would you like to elaborate on your understanding of distinctions and similarities between those 2 terms, precautionary approach and precautionary principle?
I'm not going to speak for the author on this one. Clearly, the author is suggesting that the precautionary principle is application of draconian measures where the risks are extraordinarily high, and the precautionary approach is a more flexible approach that allows continuation of human activities, but with mitigation of the risks. In our view, precautionary principle is the principle that you need to deal with scientific uncertainty and manage in the face of scientific uncertainty. The precautionary approach, as it relates to how we go about our business, is the use of limit reference points to define the population of fish that we're managing as either in a critical zone where much care must be taken and very little fishing mortality, a cautious zone, or a zone where there's a lot of ability to maneuver in taking decisions. But in this case, what he's suggesting is that the principle is where you're dealing with something like toxic waste dumping, or some activity that is clearly extraordinarily high risk, huge consequences, and consequences that could be very difficult to reverse or long-term in duration. So in that case, you take draconian action. So we make a distinction. We don't share the same view, but in our view, as he suggested, precautionary approach. What we do there is we understand that there's a potential risk. We understand that we don't know the risk in absolute detail and that we can't quantify it down to a very precise level, but we take measures to mitigate the risk notwithstanding, and that we endeavor to manage the activity, whether it's aquaculture or fisheries or whatever, to ensure that the impacts on the ecosystem are not severe or irreversible.
And so that use of the precautionary approach and adaptive management would be an approach that the DFO would take, not just with respect to aquaculture, but really managing salmon stocks generally, including wild salmon stocks, correct?
That's correct.
So, for example, in the commercial fishery, an example of a precautionary approach might be when you're looking at strong stocks and weak stocks, to take a harvesting strategy which is adaptive to the reality of that particular year and is precautionary in its harvesting, for example, to use that example other than aquaculture.
Well, I think when we're seeing the precautionary approach, what we want to do is try to find a mechanism to have the harvesting such that it's selective, doesn't overly harvest weak co-migrating stocks, and where we can, to find a strategy to allow a reasonable harvest rate on the stronger stocks. By adaptive, I think that just means that we learn. If what we have right now is overly restrictive and doesn't require that, we may find that out in time and be able to adapt our approach to exercising the precautionary approach. On the other hand, if we find that a risk that we are understanding that we have an understanding of a risk right now that we think we're mitigating, and we find out that that's not adequate action, we'll have to take more significant action in the future. So adaptive means as we learn from subsequent research and from exercise and precaution over the course of a number of years, we may learn more that would require us to change our approach.
I've had the look from council, but I haven't yet had the hook, so I'm just going to ask for one more exhibit to be put up. 1591, one page only.
Well, Mr. Blair's about to find out the hook comes very closely after the look. we are several minutes over.
PDF page 11. And just very quickly, this is exhibit 1591. This screen shot demonstrates an example of how SIA and Fisheries Act deals with aquaculture in terms of licensing, to look at some of the issues that you've been talking about, socio-economic ecosystem, adaptive, precautionary approaches to licensing of aquaculture facilities. Would somebody like to say, I agree, in which case I'll sit down? Or, I guess I'll sit down even if you say I disagree, but
No, I agree.
thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Council, for the indulgence.
My name is Gregory McDade, and I appear for Dr. Morton and the Aquaculture Coalition. I have, Mr. Commissioner, I have 45 minutes, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Let me start first just simply by marking a few documents, and then I'll commence asking questions. Mr. Lane, can we have exhibit for IDP, as in Paul? It's tab 1 of my material. Ms. Farlinger, when you were in the stand on December 9th, you were asked to identify that document, and then I think somebody forgot to come back to you after the break. You took the...
I believe it's Exhibit 1913.
Oh, it has been marked? All right, never mind then. Thank you. Apologize for that. Tab 36 of the aquaculture documents. Dr. Richards, this is an email string between Dr. Morton and yourself, dated December 20th, 2010. I'd just like you to identify that is an accurate email.
Yes, that is correct.
Can we have that as the next exhibit, please?
I don't mind that as long as it's clear that it's in for the communication being made and not for the truth of the content.
Let me be clear and say that that is an email exchange which I was part.
Yes, that's all I'm asking.
The exhibit 1933.
The tab 13, please. Exhibit, this is an email string in which both you, Ms. Farlinger, and you, Dr. Richards, are on. It's dated, it's from Kyle Garver, dated October 23rd, 2009. Perhaps you, Dr. Richards, can identify that this is an accurate email string.
Yes, that is. It's accurate in that that was part of the email, yes.
So can we have that as the next exhibit?
1934.
And finally, supplemental tab P from the aquaculture list, Mr. Lung. Should be a memorandum for the Assistant Deputy Minister.
I'm not sure I have that ready to hand. It'll take me just a moment to bring it up. Sorry about that.
All right, let's, don't let me sit down without reminding me.
Thank you.
All right, I'll move on to the questions. We'll come back to that. Dr. Richards, I just want to follow up on some questions that you were asked by Commission Counsel on Friday. I take it in terms of the focus of research on the on disease. You agreed with Commission Counsel that Dr. Kent had the focus right, which was that primarily the research has been dealt with in terms of looking at cultured fish rather than at the effects of disease on wild fish. Can I have Dr. Kent's report up? That's Exhibit 1449, page 23.
I think your wording is not quite accurate.
All right, well, I'll ask him. Now, in the third line of his State of the Science section, Dr. Kent says, the state of the science for understanding the impacts of pathogens on wild salmon in British Columbia is minimal, particularly compared to that of aquaculture. And that's true, is it not? There's very little research on wild salmon diseases.
We have done some research on wild salmon, but I think I agree that there are certainly many unanswered questions.
Further down in the next paragraph, in the middle of the next paragraph, he says, that in recent years, there are various well-accepted approaches that have been used to evaluate impacts of disease in wild animal populations. And he says 2 lines further down, in recent years, this type of research has not been well supported, as is considered by some funding agencies to be merely survey work and not hypothesis driven. That's a correct statement as well, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I just need a minute to read that. I'm not sure that I would agree with that within our context. I think what he is referring to is probably largely within the university context. He's currently sitting in a university position, and funding for universities like his, he's probably looking for funding through something such as National Science Foundation in the US, and that would require more hypothesis-driven research. Certainly within the government context, I think we do think that survey work and monitoring is important and is part of the function that government would carry out.
Well, Dr. Richard, did you read the Project 1 and Project 5 reports that the Commission is considering?
I have seen those reports, yes.
Yes, and if I suggest to you that all of the report authors agreed or put forward the proposition that there's simply not enough research on disease in wild salmon to be able to draw conclusions around disease transfer mechanisms.
I think that, I think any scientist you will speak to will say that there isn't enough research in any other fields, but I do agree that I would like to see more research on this, on diseases in wild fish in general. I do agree that that is an area that has not been very, very thoroughly researched.
Well, there's been very little research by your department in relation to the transfer of disease from fish farms to wild fish.
That's a very, very specific line that you're suggesting.
Yes.
I mean, I think the first thing is to understand exactly what diseases are taking place. And there certainly has been some work that has been done on the area of diseases, and particular, looking at what's going on in terms of salmon returning up the river. There's been some work done in certainly in the spawning ground context for sockeye.
But let me put that question specifically to you. Research into the transmission of disease from fish farms to wild fish, I suggest to you, there are no studies that DFL has done in the last decade that relate to that. Would that be fair?
No, I don't think that would be fair.
Which?
I think that we have done some work, but let me say, first of all, I think your comment has a hypothesis in it, in that the transfer is only one way. I think the scientists I've spoken to would argue that that actually goes both ways, that there also could be a concern of aquaculture fish picking up disease from wild fish. Certainly within the context of work that we have done in the Broughton Archipelago, we have done some work looking at models for water circulation. We have done some work to look at how far particles would travel, and the kind of paths they would take and the time that they would travel. So I think that does go to address some of the that issue that you just raised.
You talk about the vector going the other way, but what I'm suggesting to you is you've done no research about the transmission of disease from fish farms to wild fish.
I do not agree with that. I will not agree to that.
Can you name a study?
I don't have a list of particular study names in front of me.
Will you provide those to Commission
But we
Council?
have done significant numbers of studies within the Broughton Archipelago. I think there are lots of work that we have done within the context of the Broughton Archipelago.
Those relate to sea lice, don't they?
Yes.
I'm talking about disease, viruses.
Okay, that was a different question that I had not understood your
All right,
context.
so now if you understand the question in that context, you'd agree with me?
So let me understand specifically. So what you're asking is, have we done any studies to look at disease transmission from aquaculture fish into the wild?
Yes.
I think that Dr. Garver, when he was here on the stand, did describe some of the work that he was doing in conjunction with our modelers, our circulation modelers, that would be looking at the dispersal of virus-type particles within the water column.
So this is work that's underway now.
That's correct.
But over the last decade, there hasn't been any work done on this. We're starting to do the work, but we haven't done the work in the past.
I mean, I think what we do is, in terms of the work that we do, we try to do research which addresses the questions that were asked of the day. And these questions have now been raised, and we're trying to address them.
Oh, but, so we can agree, Dr. Notes, as I took his report, said there was the lack of fish health information for wild fish is a serious deficiency. You'd agree with that?
Well, serious is a value judgment word. I agree that there is a lack of evidence on this and a large number of other topics.
Dr. Stevens said the health research paradigm for fish diseases has been one of eradication or control of specific pathogens that limit productivity and survival of fish in fish culture settings. And this has largely defined health as the absence of disease of cultured salmon rather than the capacity for wild salmon to thrive and survive. Do you agree with that statement?
I'm not familiar exactly with that particular statement. I'm not sure. I'd have
The
to.
point is that the science has largely focused on cultured fish, disease in cultured fish, rather than looking at the risks of transfer to wild fish.
There has been a lot of work that's done on cultured fish, yes, I agree, but there has also been some work, I think, that we have done in sort of our hatchery context, which is a little bit different, I think, than what you're referring to, and also work that's been done in spawning channels for sockeye.
Right, but nothing relating to fish farms in the migratory routes.
If you're asking me if I think that we need to do more research, yes, I would agree that more research could and should be done, and I hope that we will continue to do more research.
All right, can we go to page 24 of Dr. Kent's report, the next page? Bottom of the first paragraph there. So Dr. Kent concluded that based on the fact that there's so little research on that point, we cannot conclude that a specific pathogen is a major cause of demise to the Fraser River sockeye salmon. However, pathogens cannot be excluded at this time, as adequate research on the impacts of disease on this population has not been conducted. In other words, there's not enough science on the wild salmon to be able to say one way or the other whether the disease is the cause. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
I think I guess again, we need to make sure that we put this into specific context. I think that I agree that we could do more work on pathogens. But at this point, and I think that we have also indicated in the notes that we have done that some types of disease could be a probable cause. So I think we have been upfront about the possibility that there is some disease that's contributing to this. Whether it's going to be the only cause, I think we've also heard that there's a lot of suggestions that there are cumulative effects here, and it isn't just one thing that is really the issue, Mr. Commissioner. It's most likely a multiplicity of issues which are really at stake here, and certainly I don't disagree that disease could be one of the factors which is implicated.
Yes. No, my questions go to the question of what science has been done in the past. You'll agree with me, I think, that DFO has had responsibility for protection of the wild fish even before the transfer of aquaculture jurisdiction in 2010. Maybe that's a better question for the Deputy Minister. Let me ask it again. DFO had responsibility for protection of the wild salmon prior to December 2010.
It certainly had responsibility for managing with the tools that we have and the knowledge that we have, yes.
So if disease in wild stocks was being caused by aquaculture facilities, that's a risk that DFO would have been responsible for dealing with.
To some extent, yes, but I don't think we had seen evidence in those days that there was disease in wild salmon as a result of the salmon farms.
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Dr. Richards, that that's because you never studied it?
No, I don't think that that's a fair statement.
Well, I thought we agreed there was no studies of showing the transfer of virus from fish farms to wild fish.
I think the issue really is, well, first of all, you've got a very narrow context here, and I think I need to be careful to look at this in a much broader context. I mean, first of all, what is the overall state of health of the fish on the farms? And so was there in fact disease there that even could have been transferred? And so I think that's a different question.
So are you saying that in your opinion there's been no disease present on fish farms in the last 20 years?
I think you're trying to put words in my mouth.
Well,
No,
I thought
I'm
that's
not
what-
saying,
Well, yes
no,
or
but
no?
I'm saying that you need to look, there have certainly been, audits and statements on that, and I know that in evidence you've already looked at the database of diseases that's been reported in your earlier evidence. So I think, but I'm just saying, because there is a farm doesn't mean that there is always disease.
When there is a disease on the farm, and we have heard lots of evidence about disease on farms, it's my understanding that DFO cannot point to any studies where they've looked at whether those diseases have caused problems and been transferred to the wild stocks. You simply haven't done the studies. Is that right or wrong?
I think that we would have done studies if we had thought that we had seen any evidence that was a possibility. If we had, but I am not. I mean, the studies that I'm aware of, I've already mentioned.
Excuse me if I may, and not being an expert in this field, but it seems to me that over the period of time that the farms have been there, certainly the advice that I would be receiving from scientists is whether or not there was a disease outbreak that they were aware of, there would have been some correlations to whether or not there was some potential impact on the salmon, and it would depend on the time of year, it would depend on the where they are in the cycle, and maybe there were no salmon going by. So there's not, I think it would be difficult for any of us here to make an immediate leap to a statement that said there was no, at least not even any thinking about it. We would not say that, but we are not, any of us at this panel, the ones who would have sat down and made those determinations over the course of a few years. Presumably those people have already given evidence at the panel.
Yes, well, that's why the nature of my questions is, as I hear your evidence today, I think what you're saying is, we didn't see any evidence of impacts of disease on the wild salmon, so we didn't do any studies about it. Would that be fair?
I don't know. I'm answering in the general as to how things would have occurred. I was not there, and none of us would have been the direct people to be making those decisions.
The context of my statement is that we've heard evidence from all of the Project 5 scientists and the Project 1 scientists that there's a serious gap in the science on this question. And what I'm trying to do is understand how you can say there's no evidence of something when you haven't studied it.
I think we agree that there is, this is an area where there hasn't been as much research as potentially some of the other areas. But you've asked us a very specific question within a broad area where I think that we could certainly do more research.
Yes.
So you're focusing on a very specific research question within a suite of things where we could do more work.
All right. Can we have tab 12 on the screen, please? Okay. Well, let's do that while I remember.
Okay.
Tab P up. Probably, Deputy, you're the right person to ask this question. This is, I understand, a draft memorandum that was prepared in relation to the transition licensing and on the question of whether these sites would be grandfathered. Can you just identify that, and or Ms. Farlinger, and so I could mark that as the next exhibit? It's been provided by Canada's legal counsel.
I can identify that this is a cover page for such a memo.
Well, can we go to the next page? Can we identify it as the memo now?
Whether a memo is or a draft or final depends on whether it's signed at the end. So I'm not trying to be obstructive. I'm just trying to figure out whether this is a draft memo or whether this was finally a memo that went
Well,
forward.
We were told it was draft, but
Okay.
let's, can we have that marked as the next exhibit?
1935.
Thank you. And now tab 12. Just below the first question and answer there. This is a document prepared by DFO in terms of question and answers. And I think this relates to Dr. Miller's research. It's prepared by Diane Lake. And you'll see the first sentence there, Dr. Richards, under the answers. Fisheries and Oceans Canada has not conducted research associated with this particular disease and salmon farms and would not speculate on such a link. That's a fair statement, isn't it? You can't speculate on whether or not there's such a link without doing some research.
First of all, I think that I'm not sure I would quite agree with the actual wording here about disease, because I'm not sure this is in the context, I think, of the work of Christy Miller. And I'm not sure that we've actually identified that there is actually a disease. We've identified that there is a genomic signature. But it is true that we have not looked for that signature on aquaculture sites at this point.
Can we have that made the next exhibit?
1936.
And can I have tab 46 up on the screen? This is a document in terms of the funding request for Dr. Johnson to do his research. I think this is one of the studies you're referring to, Dr. Richards, that are ongoing. Do you recognize that document?
I think I would like to see the context of that, but I believe that that is, I believe that that was part of a proposal for Dr. Johnson to do some work that was already discussed probably in his evidence. And I did raise this question earlier last week, or I did speak to this in general terms last week.
Can we just get the first sentence under introduction enlarged, Mr. Hunt? Now this is Dr. Johnson's statement. The role that pathogens and host physiology play in determining growth and survival of sockeye salmon following seawater entry is unknown. Is that a fair statement?
It's a bit strong, but it's not to say that we don't know anything, but I'd say that in general our knowledge is very limited on these topics.
It is plausible, is it not, and a legitimate risk, Dr. Richards, that fish farms amplify disease in the natural environment.
That could be a possibility.
And
but disease could also be amplified by other stocks like herring, which are in schools and in that area.
But you recognize that the unnatural density of fish in a fish farm is an ideal situation for the amplification of disease.
I'm not sure the ideal I would agree to, but I would agree that it is possible that yes. In general, I would agree that there could be amplification in that situation.
Have you looked at the disease databases that were presented before the commission?
Personally, no, I have not.
Ms. Dansero, have you?
No.
And either of the other members of the panel? Have you looked at the disease databases and the amount of disease that was found in there?
I may have seen them, but I certainly haven't reviewed them in detail.
Can we have Exhibit 1565 on the screen, please? And while we're going there, let me suggest, sorry, I should mark that last document as an exhibit, please.
Is this a document that Dr. Johnson authored?
Yes.
Did you put it to him?
No.
Well, why are we marking it as an exhibit now?
I'm putting it to Dr. Richards.
I both asked questions and made my submissions on it.
Yes.
I do want to be clear that on this document, I can't verify that that's what it is, that you referenced it as describing that project. It likely is, but I can't verify the source.
We should mark it for identification purposes then, Mr. David.
We marked as KKK, triple K.
Document 1565 then? You will go under the fish health audit tab, I think it's the fourth tab, and scroll across to the keep scrolling across. There we go, to the diagnosis and comments. This is, Dr. Richards, you haven't seen this.
I have not seen this.
If we could look down to the larger box there at the towards the bottom of the page, you see where the mouse is now? There is active infectious disease at the population level. You see that?
Yes.
Can we scroll down a couple more boxes? You see 2 boxes further down. There, BKD is active at the population level.
Yes, I see that.
All right. Now, there's a number of similar comments in this document that we looked at in the commission. My suggestion to you is you are aware that despite all the fish health management plans that the province has in place, there is regularly disease at the population level in fish farms. Were you aware of that, Dr. Richards?
I think that that's not strictly within my area of responsibility is to look at that. That is looked at certainly by our management group that's dealing with this, but that is not strictly within my area of responsibility.
So who in DFO would be aware of that? Well, let me first ask. I think these documents refer to the pre-2010 period in 2007 and 8 and 9. Was the province under any obligation to report to DFO about active disease at the population level? Ms. Dansereau or Ms. Farlinger, do you know?
I don't know the answer.
Is there a department of DFO whose job it was prior to 2010 to actually deal with these diseases that were present at the population level?
The Fish Health Group in Science regularly consulted with and advised the province on the fish health plans. I don't know specifically how they dealt with these audits.
So the fish health plans are the documents that are prepared in advance of disease. Once a disease hits, there was, I don't believe, anyone in DFO whose job it was to do anything about it. Would that be fair?
I don't know the answer to the question, sorry.
So you can't think of anyone under your organization chart whose daily job or weekly job was to actually protect the wild salmon from diseases that were actually occurring on fish farms. There's nobody at DFO who does that.
As I understand it in the broader context, particularly at the time when the province was requiring these fish health plans, and I think this audit is from that time, I think that's what you said, that the decisions, the veterinarians in the province would have set out what fish health actions needed to be taken to deal with problems as they pertain to the fish in the pond and therefore to the fish in the surrounding areas. That's my understanding of how it worked.
Right, so you relied on the province. There was nobody at DFO to do this. Is that fair?
We provided advice to the province when asked, specifically on the matter of the fish health plan and on matters relating to disease.
When we say we consulted with the fish health people, you would mean people at science under Dr. Richards' department? You're nodding, is that a yes?
That's true.
Now, Dr. Richards, you would then know, as I understood it, the people at Fish Health were scientists who did research. I didn't think they had a regulatory responsibility. There isn't anybody under the science department that was required to act when disease was found on fish farms. Is that fair?
I think that is a fair statement.
And there's nobody today who has that responsibility, is there?
Well,
in your department?
No, the issue for science is to provide advice, but it's not necessarily to take action. But we are under a different regulatory regime today.
When a disease strikes in fish farms, and we've heard evidence from Dr. Corman that there's some 30 fish health events per year of the kinds of diseases that are a serious risk to wild salmon. When a disease strikes today, is there anybody in your department who's got a responsibility to go study the impacts of it?
There is a fish health monitoring section, including veterinarians who audit the compliance with the fish health plan, and the veterinarians who work for the aquaculture program in DFO then work with the veterinarians on the farm. I don't know specifically what the response is, but the response is generally around the health of the fish on the farm, so that the fish on the farm are healthy. So then mitigating the opportunity for the spread of anything to wild fish.
But you accept that there are diseases happening no matter how good your fish health management plans are?
There are also a number of these diseases that are endemic in the wild sockeye populations as well.
Well, let me ask my question again. You accept that there are diseases happening in the fish farms despite the fish health management plans?
As I understand the fish health management plans, they are to deal with and manage the disease to produce a healthy fish farm. So yes, is the answer.
Thank you. But once a disease hits in a fish farm, there's nothing to stop the pathogens from going through the nets into the water in contact with the wild salmon, is there?
I can't claim to be an expert on the treatments of those diseases and how those affect the potential to spread that disease to the wild fish, so I can't answer your question.
Dr. Richards, you can answer that question. You know those pathogens go from a diseased fish out into the water, don't they?
I mean, if the pathogens are waterborne, then they can be carried out as they could be carried in.
And I don't think, Ms. Farlinger, that there's any rules in any fish health management plans I've seen that prohibit the transfer of pathogens through a net into the open water.
As I understand it, the fish health plans set out a strategy or application to deal with fish health problems when they arise in order to control or eradicate them.
Now, Dr. Richards, let's go back to the question of what science DFO has done. Have you done any science to determine whether these fish health management plans reduced the incidence of transfer of disease to wild salmon or not?
I think let me just be clear about what you're talking about with disease. I think we have certainly done quite a lot of work in that regard in relationship to sea lice. But if you're speaking about other kinds of disease,
viruses,
in terms of viruses, and I have to agree that we have done some work on viruses. We have not done extensive work on viruses.
And let me suggest also, to follow up on a question that was asked Thursday, that if you haven't done any work on the transfer of viruses from individual fish farms, there's certainly no studies at all as to the transfer of viruses from a collection of fish farms, the cumulative impact of fish passing multiple farms with disease. There's no science at all been done by DFO to determine what those impacts are. Is that fair?
Well, I did mention that we have initiated some projects looking at the circulation, so we would be able to do that. And as I recall from some of the work that we have done so far, viruses do not stay active very long in the water column as part of this transport. As my understanding, and talking to Dr. Garber, is that they are quite quickly pass out through UV radiation.
Well, that's a study that's still underway, is it not?
I believe it is still underway. I'm
Right,
not
that's-
sure of all the details.
Well, it's admirable. I'm pleased that the DFO is now doing this study, but if you're doing it now, that means it hadn't been done before.
If I may just interject, you're making it sound as though the farms are infested with disease and remain infested with disease without any actions taken to prevent, to clear up the disease.
No,
At
I'm
least
not
that's
saying
how
that.
it's sounding, that it's an entirely infested area. And it's in no one's interest, certainly not in the farmer's interest, to maintain disease-ridden fish farms. So actions are taken, and the amounts, there's been no evidence to indicate that there is this sort of cross
And to be fair, Deputy,
infection.
to be fair, there's no evidence that there isn't. Is there? Because you haven't studied it. That's the evidence before the commission, that that evidence doesn't exist.
The extreme position that would result from your description is that there would be no fish. There would be no wild fish because there would be only disease-ridden, mutated fish of some type. But there are fish, and there have been cycles that have been going on long before any fish farms were there. So there has been no evidence to support that the disease has had any impact. There are things that we will be doing now that we are the regulator or playing a greater role in regulation. But so far, the department has been keeping an eye on these things, and these are questions that we regularly ask without necessarily targeting science to go do the work, because there hasn't been, in our priority setting exercises, evidence to this point to say that this ought to be done.
I don't want to belabor the obvious, but didn't in 2009 a whole bunch of fish disappear? Isn't that why we're here?
Yes, and didn't in 2010 a whole lot more come back.
And in 2009, your department believes that disease played a role.
We are incredibly interested in finding out what this commission will determine at the end of its deliberations. We are continuing to ask ourselves the same questions, and we will continue to do so.
So but when the siting decisions that were made for the farms that are in the constrained areas, can we have 1563 up on the screen? For these areas, let me suggest to you there was no science upon which people could depend to determine whether or not these farms would have impacts on the wild salmon migrating sockeye. That's a fair statement, is it not?
I wouldn't know.
I think I should say that 10 years ago, at that time, we had in place, and in fact there had recently been an aquaculture forum in BC hosted by the BC government that looked at these things, a host of siting criteria, which our then, as was our regulatory responsibility, our habitat biologists looked at in terms of siting of farms. And they had to do with the location of salmon rivers, salmon estuaries, as well as a host of other valued ecosystem components. So while the science was not in a state to evaluate any disease implications, there certainly were things that were considered with respect to salmon stocks and with respect to the potential impacts on wild salmon. And then following that, for example, the returns of stocks in the areas surrounding farms did not in any way, which is something we measure each and every year, did not provide us with a reason to go looking at that problem. So there is some context, and there were some previous considerations of this, although not nearly as specific as we're talking about here today, and as the research that is going on today.
So, as I understood, Rebecca Reed testified before the commission that when her department looked at assessments of these sites back in 2005, when there was a mass amount of SIA assessments that were completed on 91 sites, I believe, she testified that they looked only at benthic impacts from DFO's perspective. There was no assessment of disease, the disease potential in the wild sockeye population. Is that correct?
The siting criteria that originally, back in the 90s, were fundamentally the checklist for any habitat biologist having a reference from the province about where a fish farm might be sited, did include a distance from salmon farms, distance from shellfish operations, and a wide variety of elements about avoiding fundamentally ecosystem values. That by the time that was examined in the mid 2000s, that was merely those elements were really merely a rough screening criteria, which today is still used, and the specificity around the actual habitat impacts was limited to the organic material on the bottom or other physical disruptions of habitat that might occur from the farms. That did not mean that the broad screening tool of siting criteria was not used. Now, I mean, at the time and in the day, avoiding salmon rivers and the mouths of salmon rivers was really the level of precautionary approach that was taken, but the kind of thing we're talking about today in terms of the research, not surprisingly, is much more specific than that. But to say there was no consideration of that, I think is not quite reasonable.
Do you consider that it would make sense to avoid the wild salmon migratory route where millions of young smolts are coming through that area? Doesn't that make sense to you today? Shouldn't that be on the criteria list?
Not as a generalist statement. We don't function from generalist statements, so we would have to investigate and continue to investigate to see whether or not there was a reason to do that.
All right, I've got to move on. I've got just one area of examination left. Can I have tab 33 on the screen, please? Now, Dr. Richards, as I understand it, much of the funding for science research relating to aquaculture came through this Aquaculture Collaborative Research and Development Program, right?
No, I mean, that is one of the sources of funding. We have had other sources of funding besides this one.
Well, there's some $59 million that's been dedicated to that over the last 5 years, hasn't there been?
This is a national program. I can't give you explicitly the figures there, but certainly there has been some substantial funding here, but there is funding also for research for aquaculture through other sources.
Page 5, under ACRDP. I'm sorry, Mr. Lund. Now, if we just highlight the first paragraph there, let me suggest to you, and you'll see this 4 lines in, that program is an industry-driven program. That's correct, isn't it, Ms. Dansero?
That's what it says.
Yes, and it provides funding that is jointly proposed by the industry and DFO.
That's what it says?
Yes, and industry people sit on the committee that assigns that funding. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Mary Ellen Walling, in fact, sits on that committee.
This is a national program. There are different committees across the country with different levels of membership. I'm not sure on which committee she may sit. She may have, or she may have for some time. I can't.
We saw an email from Dr. Miller earlier in these hearings where she was writing to Mary Ellen Walling asking her to approve the funding so she could go study the particular
well, I'm not
disease.
sure that that was because she was on that committee or not. I'm not sure exactly. I don't know what the current membership on that committee is.
And I'll just, and I'll sit down. We could go to page 2. Under rationale and relevance. You see the last sentence of the first paragraph. Their communication challenges is a negative perception of aquaculture among certain influential NGOs. In bringing a rigorous scientific approach to the issue of environmental impacts associated with aquaculture, ACRDP has the opportunity to clarify some of the misinformation that exists. That persists, yes, sorry. So part of that program is to fund science that changes, that rebuts the public perception. Is that right?
Sorry if I may. It is, from what I can gather from reading this, and I wasn't there in 2005, but It's to ensure that if there is misinformation that is in fact frightening people, real truth would be brought to bear on a question. So the fact that industry is part of that doesn't make it suspect. It simply means that real research was being done to uncover real truths. And so it's not a communications exercise, it's a science exercise to get at real answers.
If I was there, and you'll have to remember the context at the time, there's a number of studies put out that have subsequently been found to be inaccurate, relevant to contaminants in agriculture products, and they were using sampling and analytical methods to establish that these products were unsafe, when in fact they are very much the opposite. They're very good for you. And I would also point out context around how we direct science and how do we set priorities. Empirical evidence is used. So you're making the point that we don't know for sure, that haven't proven a negative, that there's no impact on disease or disease isn't being transmitted. What we were doing, as noted by Sue Farlinger, is tracking returns in those areas and looking at them relevant to history and tracking them to see if there's been a trend that would mean that we have something we missed. And we didn't see that. Therefore, that didn't trigger the kind of research that we're now undertaking, as you've noted, and that's just use of empirical information to determine whether or not there was a problem that we had not anticipated.
There were 3 studies that were done by DFO into sea lice on sticklebacks. Is that done to address communication issues, or is that done because the most pressing need for scarce DFO research dollars is to save the stickleback?
I think it's also done because stickleback is a vector. It's a species that's a vector, and we should understand the presence of sea lice in the environment, not just looking at it more narrowly. And I think there's been a lot of work done in that area. And again, I'd point out that we are looking at the returns to see if there's something we're missing in order to help direct science. And we didn't see that evidence that triggered this in the past. So we're continuing that work, and we'll like to track things so that we make sure that we aren't missing something. Right now, the concern that you're raising is viral. In the past, it was lice, and that viral now. There may be something else in the future that the best way to look at it is tracking the local populations of returning salmon.
That's my time, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you. Thank you, Pam.
Mr. McDade, would you like your tab 33 marked?
Yes, thank you.
Be 1937.
The strategic review.
That's fine.
Yes.
Perhaps a short break, Mr. Commissioner?
I'm sorry, that was 1937, was that?
Yes, correct.
Thank you very much.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.